Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are just going to wait a minute or two for some more folks to hop on, and then we will get started. So if you need to use the restroom, grab a drink, we will get started in just about 2 minutes. All right, everyone. I'm going to get us started, and then as folks trickle in, they can hop right on. But thank you all for joining us tonight. This is our last week of our 4-week series of Advocacy Academy with the ACLU. I'm Emmy. I am the field manager here at the ACLU. And tonight we will be doing a Know Our Rights training with one of our lawyers on staff, Hillary. So I will let Hillary introduce herself and take it from here.
Thanks so much, Emmy. Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary Rich, she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior staff attorney here at the ACLU of Vermont. I am so excited to be here with you all today and, rounding out our final Advocacy Academy session. And I'm really grateful to be here today to speak with you all and that you took time out of your day to learn more about your rights and responsibilities, because I know that this is a moment that feels uniquely perilous for immigrants and for everyone who is trying to build an inclusive and multicultural democracy. And at the same time, I want to place this moment in context because the United States has a long history of discriminatory and punitive laws that scapegoat immigrants. So while the breadth and certain tactics in Trump's anti-immigrant agenda are new, the animus is not. And I'm giving this overview not to diminish or invalidate the fear and urgency that people are experiencing, but to encourage us to resist the kind of paralysis that that fear can create. So, put another way, we have seen administrations target non-citizens before, and we've learned from those experiences how to fight back. And one powerful way that we can do that is by knowing our rights and feeling empowered to use them. So, you go to the next slide, please. As a few disclaimers before we get started, this presentation is for information purposes. It is not legal advice. You should always consult with a lawyer if you're arrested or if you're in removal proceedings. And this administration, policies and practices are changing very quickly. Now, as we'll discuss, the law and your rights don't change that easily, but different tactics that the administration and ICE use can change. So this information is accurate as of November 20th, 2025 at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, but just always you want to make sure you're getting the most accurate news. And I also want to flag that even if you know and exercise your constitutional rights, immigration officials might not honor them. So it is important that you don't use force or physically resist. That's never a good idea, even when you know that immigration officials are doing something wrong because it puts your safety and others at risk. Challenging that misconduct comes after the abuse happens, and we'll talk about how to do that. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to be covering a lot of information today. Unfortunately, this is going to be recorded. These slides will also be available after the presentation. So there's parts of it that I might go through quickly, but you'll have this all available afterward. We're going to be discussing today first, who actually is enforcing immigration laws to get us all on the same page. We're going to also be going over our basic rights and then importantly discussing situations of actually applying them. So specifically thinking about if ICE comes to our homes, when we witness abuses, when we're driving, when we're attending protests, and if we're arrested. We're also going to discuss some preparedness strategies so we can be proactive and plan for ICE interactions now. We'll also be discussing some of the advocacy that the ACLU is really excited to be doing in the State House this session, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. You can also feel free to drop questions in the chat throughout or use the Q&A. And I also particularly, if at any point I use an acronym that you don't understand or I'm talking too fast, please let me know. Immigration really loves to use alphabet soup, and I'll do my best to explain, but sometimes I get into bad habits. So next slide, please. So to that end, let's actually start with a few definitions. DHS is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and they are the parent agency of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they essentially operate as the immigration police inside the U.S. Another part of DHS is CBP, or Customs and Border Protection. You also might have heard of them as Border Patrol. And these are the immigration police that operate at the border. But this distinction gets a little bit messy because that at the border jurisdiction includes 100 miles outside of the border and within it, which includes almost all of Vermont except, I think, part of Brattleboro. So we often use ICE, CBP, Border Patrol interchangeably. And generally, that's fine. And for purposes of this presentation, that's totally fine. And often they are working together and collaborating because they're both under the same parent agency. Next slide, please. So let's talk about who actually is enforcing immigration laws. Immigration law is actually civil law, which means it's not criminal law. And only federal immigration agencies can enforce immigration law. So our state and local law enforcement are enforcing criminal law, which is distinct. So looking at the left side of this table, when we're talking about state and local law enforcement, I'm talking about our local police, our sheriffs, and our state troopers. They actually are not supposed to be asking about immigration status. They are limited by the Vermont Fair and Impartial Policing Policy, which is a model policy that was created by the Criminal Justice Council that actually limits a lot of collaboration between local state law enforcement and ICE and other federal agencies. So there's supposed to be in Vermont a pretty clean divide between the two different groups. Now, on the other side, we're looking at federal immigration enforcement. Those folks can and do ask about your immigration status. And that includes Border Patrol and ICE, but also their subdivisions. So you might see sometimes videos of ICE officers wearing a shirt or a vest that says HSI or ERO. Those are both parts of ICE. And as we've seen, ICE does not always properly identify themselves. President Trump has recently actually expanded immigration enforcement to include some other agency as well. So now groups like the FBI and the DEA, they can also be enforcing immigration law. Now, the reason we're kind of getting into the weeds about who is doing what is because I want to make it clear, if you know you're dealing with a Vermont police, they have no business asking about immigration. But I also want to flag that ICE often lies. They are often not identifying themselves, or they are saying that they are police, even though that's not technically true. So just be prepared that just because someone is wearing a vest that says police, that does not mean you necessarily know who you are dealing with. Next slide, please. But regardless of what law enforcement agency we're talking about, I now want to talk about our rights generally. So we know the president does have a lot of power over immigration, but there are limits. All people living in the US, regardless of their citizenship status, have certain rights. And those rights are protected in the Constitution, in federal law, which includes statutes passed by Congress, executive orders, agency regulations, but also state law. So Vermont has its own separate constitution and its own separate laws. The reason that those distinctions are important is because a lot of times we get very hung up on executive orders that the president is dropping. And those are definitely important. But executive orders actually don't always change the law. They can't override the Constitution, and they're also often really just performative. And so, even when they do try to change the law, a lot of times those actions are being challenged in court. And even in situations when the court does not do a good job of upholding our rights and a federal protection might be removed, a lot of times there is actually a state law or a state opportunity to fill that gap. So, my best recommendation when you see an executive order is not to panic, to pause, and to think about what actually has changed and what hasn't, because a lot of times it overpromises. Next slide, please. So, these are what we all have the right to, regardless of citizenship status. Next slide. We all have the right to be silent. This means you generally do not have to answer questions about your name, your place of birth, your immigration status, or your criminal history. Now, this right does not give you the ability to lie or to provide false documents, and there are exceptions, like at the border if you are a lawful permanent resident or during a traffic stop by police. For all of these rights that we're going to be talking about in this section, I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the general right, and then when we apply them, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the nuances here. When we're talking about being silent, though, it doesn't just mean the words that you're saying, it also means how you're communicating, potentially even with your body. So, for example, you might have heard stories about ICE doing like work site enforcements where they'll go to a job site and they'll say, US citizens over here, non-citizens over here, and ask people to line up. In that situation, your right to remain silent means that you don't have to move at all and you can just sit down on the ground or floor. So the right to remain silent means the right not to communicate and not just with your words. Next slide, please. We also have the right to be free from unreasonable searches. And that means that law enforcement can't search your home, your car, or you without your consent or unless they have a warrant. And you don't have to consent to a search. It is your constitutional right to refuse a search. They might do it anyway, but you don't have to give permission. And now there are exceptions of when, even when you say no, an officer can legally search you anyway. And that can be for an emergency, for a safety concern, or if you're being arrested. For example, you're being handcuffed, officers might pat you down to make sure you don't have a weapon. Next slide, please. We also have the right to be free from unreasonable seizures. A seizure is a legal term, which is essentially a stop where you don't feel free to leave or an arrest. So law enforcement can't stop or arrest you without some evidence that you have broken the law. So for something like a brief stop, not talking about like a port of entry, but just kind of a brief on the street stop, that requires reasonable suspicion, which is a little bit less than probable cause, but it's not just a hunch. So to stop you as you're just kind of walking along the street, that means that in the case of ICE, they have to have facts about you that make it reasonable to believe you are committing a violation of immigration or federal law. Now, importantly, you want to be careful because if ICE approaches you and you run, according to DHS, they are interpreting that to mean that running and fleeing from them actually gives them reasonable suspicion to arrest you. So you want to think about how that interaction could be playing out in the mind of the officer. If you are arrested or being detained, that requires probable cause, which is a reason to believe someone is violating immigration law. Now, importantly, ICE oftentimes will mess up and they will try to stop someone or even arrest someone without that probable cause. And so they'll try to get it by asking further questions and extending that interaction or asking if they can search you. So remember, you have the right to be silent and you can always refuse to consent to a search. And you can always just ask if you're stopped by any law enforcement if you're free to leave. And if you are, you calmly walk away and that ends the interaction. Next slide. We also all have the right to due process, which is sort of the legal term for like a fair proceeding. Now, immigration is a little bit different in due process than like the criminal context. But in immigration proceedings, it typically includes a right to a hearing before you'd be deported if you've been in the country for more than 2 years, a right to call a lawyer who's not court appointed. Unlike in the criminal world, in immigration land, you actually don't get a court appointed lawyer, although we will be talking about some policies to change that later. And you also have the right to call witnesses and present evidence on your behalf. Next slide, please. And rounding out some of our rights, we all have the right to free speech and free association. This includes the right to protest and criticize the government, to join groups that are doing that, to talk about and publicize truthful information about law enforcement. So you might see, people posting on like social media that they have seen, ICE arresting someone at this location. If that's legal to do that. It's also legal to educate people about their legal rights. So I am right now exercising my First Amendment rights to talk to you all about what the Constitution protects. Now, of course, there are exceptions. It's illegal to help people violate the law. So I can't legally sit here and tell you how to avoid or scam ICE. That is illegal. It's also illegal to give legal advice if you are not a lawyer. And the First Amendment essentially prohibits retaliation by the government for exercising those rights. So it's protecting you from government censorship, but it's not giving you the right to say anything, anywhere without consequences. Next slide, please. All right, so those are your general rights. And you've probably listening thought a few times like, but wait, what about? And we're going to be talking about those now. So let's discuss how we're actually applying those rights to when we encounter ICE and some of the exceptions that operate. Next slide, please. All right, first, let's talk about when ICE comes to your door, so at your home, and rules are pretty much the same for your house or an apartment. Doesn't matter if you are a renter or a homeowner, you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your own home. So, if ICE knocks, they may say they are police. They may not be wearing uniforms. They may be wearing a badge that says ICE, but they all may also not be. You have the right to ask to see identification, and you can also ask to see a warrant. And importantly, you do not have to open that door or consent to ICE gaining entry unless they have a valid judicial warrant. Next slide, please. Let's talk more about warrants. So that valid judicial warrant has to include a judge's name and signature. It needs to have the person's name and or address if they're supposed to be arrested or searched. It needs to have a date and time frame, and it can't be expired. It needs to have the name of the agency that's conducting that search and arrest. And there also needs to be a description of the items that are being searched. In contrast, ICE will usually not have a warrant. If they have any document, it's probably going to be something called an administrative subpoena or an ICE warrant. These are not the same as valid judicial warrants. They are issued by DHS and often have a DHS seal or form number. They are signed by an immigration officer or an immigration judge, not a separate federal judge. And they might state that their authority comes from immigration law, often something called the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, instead of from a court. Next slide, please. This picture's a little bit blurry, but we'll send around the slides afterwards. And this compares on the left, you are seeing a judicial warrant, and on the right, you are seeing an administrative or ICE warrant. So looking at the left first, at the top, you can see that it's coming from a US district court. That is a federal court. There's also a name and address on it, but remember, that has to be correct. There's information about the person or property being searched. There's a date, but check it's not expired, and it's signed by a judge. So I can't tell you just from this, I know this is a judicial warrant, but I can't tell you if it's actually valid because I don't know all of the details on it, like date and name of the person. Looking at the right, though, I can tell you this kind of warrant does not give ICE the right to enter your home without your permission. We can see at the top, it says U.S. Department of Homeland Security, not a court. It is a warrant for an arrest of an alien, which is the discriminatory term that DHS likes to use for non-citizens, which is not search or seizure. And we can see that it's signed by an immigration officer and not by a judge. So the reason that I am really harping on the importance of warrants is because anecdotally, advocates say that over 9 times out of 10, ICE does not have any kind of document with them that justifies what they're trying to do. If they do have a piece of paper, it is more often than not going to be that administrative ICE warrant. But people are too afraid to ask for a warrant and they don't know what to look for if they actually do. Because I know if I didn't know better and I was given a piece of paper by an armed officer, My instinct also might be to just assume it was official, but we have to be skeptical and demand they show their work. Next slide, please. So, if they do have that warrant, in the unlikely scenario that they have a warrant, it's actually valid, you want to think first about still not necessarily opening the door right away. So to confirm all those facts, you can have them hold it up to the window or just slide it under the door. And remember to check, is it the right name, correct address, current date, signed and stamped by a judge? Now, um, and if it doesn't have all of those boxes checked, you have the right to refuse a search or seizure. You don't have to open the door and let them inside, and you can say, I don't consent to your entry. Now, people sometimes ask, but like, wait, what if I did open the door? Because this is Vermont. If someone comes to my door, my instinct is just to open it and be friendly. That is fine. That is human. The reason that I'm saying it's a better idea to not open the door at all is because sometimes officers interpret that as consent to enter. But let's say you've opened the door and now you realize, uh-oh, it's immigration enforcement. I don't want them in my home. What you can choose to do is step outside and close the door behind you, just to make it clear that even though you are speaking with them, you are not giving them permission to enter your house. Next slide, please. Now, let's say you have done everything right, and um, they're still insisting on trying to gain access. You still have the right to remain silent. You can refuse to answer questions about where you were born or how you entered the US. You can refuse to show identity documents or say what country you're from. If you don't want to speak, you can say, I choose to remain silent, or give them a Know Your Rights card. And remember, if you decide to speak, you can always just shut the door behind you. Next slide, please. Now, let's say you've done everything right. You have asked for a warrant. Either they don't have one or it's not valid. You've made it clear that you're not consenting to entry, and ICE is just forcing their way in anyway. In that moment, it is not a good idea to resist. It's going to make the situation more dangerous for you and more dangerous for others around you. You can clearly say you don't consent to their entry. Remember, they could be wearing body cameras, so that could be important evidence. And you can ask a friend or a family member to openly record what's happening. But still, even though they've broken the law, this does not give you kind of a freebie. You still don't have the right to lie or provide false documents, and you may request a lawyer. Next slide, please. All right, now let's talk a little bit about if you are seeing that arrest or that ICE abuse. So I just talked a little bit about how you could ask a family member or friend to record. But if you are the witness, it's also important to know that you have certain rights too. And what I want you to be doing in this situation is not thinking like a vigilante, but thinking like a lawyer. So if ICE has decided to arrest someone, these are armed agents with, federal authority and a vendetta. There's not a way that you are physically going to safely be able to stop them. Instead, think like a lawyer and document for later. So you have the right to film an arrest as long as you don't interfere. You'll want to do that openly and from a safe distance and follow safety instructions. So what I mean by that is if ICE tells you you need to, take a step back, do it and actually film, point the camera down at your feet, film yourself stepping back and record that to prove you're complying with those orders. You want to also focus your camera on ICE, not on the person being arrested, because if this footage is eventually decided to be made public, you don't want to risk retaliation against the person being arrested or their families. So instead, think about if you can capture the documents. So if they had any kind of paper, you'll want to try to film what that paper was, their badges, and their uniforms. Now, ICE does not have the right to confiscate your camera or your footage, but they may say they do, and that is a lie. So for that reason, we strongly recommend that people do not lock their phones with Face ID or with a fingerprint ID. Instead, the securest way to keep your information and your device safe is to use a passcode. And the reason I'm saying that is because we've heard, reports of officers, holding someone's phone up to their face, which under Face ID allows it to unlock, and then they can access the phone without the person's consent. And some lawyers are concerned that the courts are eventually going to say, well, people don't really have a right to privacy in their own face. So ICE can use their face to unlock their phone versus you do have the right to privacy, in your confidential PIN. So passcodes, not Face ID, not fingerprints. I know it's a hassle, but it makes sure your device more secure. Now, let's say you just were not quick on the draw to get your cell phone out, or it wasn't safe to do so, and you weren't able to record that arrest or that interaction. That is okay. You have not missed your moment. Instead, you can record what had happened afterward by just writing it down. So just take notes after the arrest. Think about the number of people and their names, the time and place. Did they refuse entry? Was there any damage done in the search or the arrest, and take photos of it? And similarly, was anybody hurt? You should want to take pictures of any injuries or if someone had to get medical treatment. So those are all ways that you can create evidence, important evidence after the fact that you can use to help that person who was arrested potentially challenge that arrest. Next slide. All right, now let's talk about what happens when you are just kind of out driving. And first, we're going to talk about generally when you're out in the world. Let's say you're driving on like 89 near Waterbury, not when you're at the border or at any kind of immigration checkpoint. So, if you are, driving along and you are stopped by immigration or any law enforcement, you want to stop the car in a safe place, turn it off immediately, and turn on the emergency lights. So, want to open or crack the window and put your hands on the wheel to show that you're not a threat. Now, if upon request, you can show your driver's license or your driver's privilege cards, your registration, and your proof of insurance. In that situation, you still generally have the right to remain silent. I mean, you do have to show your license and your registration and proof of ID because, you don't have a constitutional right to drive a car, so you need to give information about that. But otherwise, you don't have to answer other questions. And if you're a passenger, you're not driving the car, you don't have to show your driver's license or answer questions in that situation. Um, but let's say you are being stopped by immigration specifically. Now, if they ask for it, and if you have valid immigration documents and you are over the 18 years of age, the law actually requires that you carry those documents with you. So, for example, if you're a green card holder, the law says that you are supposed to have that with you at all times. And if immigration asks for it, you are supposed to show that to them. But if you're an immigrant without documents, you can decline the officer's request, although the agent is almost certainly at that point going to be asking you more questions. Now, the rules at checkpoints are a little bit different. When you're out driving, kind of just like in the center of Vermont, you're not supposed to be stopped without that reasonable suspicion we talked about earlier. So the officer is supposed to have some facts that indicate that you're violating the law. Checkpoints are different. So at like a fixed checkpoint or like at the border, Border Patrol doesn't need any kind of suspicion to ask you brief immigration questions, and they can look at your car. And at border crossings, agents don't need a warrant or any kind of justification or even suspicion of wrongdoing to call what courts have referred to as like a routine search. So, a quick look through your luggage or your vehicle. Those are the rules of the border. That's not the rules of the general road. Um, and however, so if that's kind of the brief interaction that everybody could be subject to. But if Border Patrol wants to detain you longer than that, they do need reasonable suspicion. And if they want to arrest you, they need probable cause. So the initial interaction, everybody's kind of fair game, but to do more than just a brief stop and general immigration questions, they're supposed to have more evidence of that you have broken the law. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about if you encounter ICE at a protest. Now, your rights when you're protesting are really dependent on where you're protesting. And so what that means is, for example, if you're protesting, on a sidewalk or you're protesting in a park, those are called traditional public forums that are where your rights are the strongest. Like we expect to see protests and discussions and lively debate there. In contrast, Let's say you want to protest on private property or inside a business. That's where your rights are going to be much more limited, and a private property owner can ask you to leave. So, for example, if you want to protest in the middle of a park, rights are the strongest. If you want to protest in my living room, I can ask you to leave. Rights depend on place. If you're attending a protest, the general best practice is to tell a friend, a family member, and an immigration attorney if you're a non-citizen and you have one. You also, it's a good idea to leave your cell phone at home if you're like me and will not do that. Instead, remember to turn off your fingerprint or Face ID. Also, turn off your location tracking, your Bluetooth, and your Wi-Fi. You should go into a protest kind of planning for the worst and thinking that maybe you're going to get arrested and maybe you're going to, lose access to your cell phone. Not that I'm saying that's likely, but just plan for the worst, hope for the best. And in that case, it's a good idea, if you're also like me and don't know anyone's phone number, to write down a few phone numbers actually like on your body. So I've seen people just kind of with like washable marker on their arms. That way, if they're arrested and don't have their phone, they still know who they can call. And if you are actually approached by ICE in this situation, or any law enforcement, you want to stay calm, keep your hands visible. Remember, you can always ask if you are free to leave, and you can always verbally refuse consent to a search, but not a good idea to physically resist that search. Next slide, please. Now let's say ICE isn't approaching you, but you just kind of see them at a protest. In that situation, you can take pictures or video of the agent, but again, remember, try not to capture like the people being targeted or the general crowd because you don't know the immigration status of your fellow protesters and you don't want to put a target on their backs. You also want to alert rapid response networks about ICE activity and try to be specific as possible. So think about if you can say the location where you're at, the number of agents you're seeing, what they're wearing, what they're driving, what they're doing. For example, are they arresting one person? Are they kind of meandering through the crowd? Do they have any weapons? And are they collaborating with police, which in Vermont should not be happening. So very important if you see that occurring. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about if you are arrested and what your rights are in that situation. So remember, an ICE arrest or detention without a warrant requires probable cause or a reason to believe someone is violating immigration law. And remember, if ICE doesn't have probable cause when they arrest you, they might try to get it through the interaction by asking you more questions, so you always have your right to remain silent. If you're arrested by ICE, you may be detained in a state prison, or you could be transferred out of state. We've seen that happen with some folks. You remember, have that right to remain silent. You can say that you want a lawyer first. You don't have to tell them your country or your citizenship or immigration status, really to any police or jail official. You don't need to sign anything. Too often we are seeing ICE, show people a form and say, this will, help you get released or help this go away. And people just sign without reading, which is a terrible idea. You can and should call your contacts to, request legal assistance, but you do not want to talk about your arrest on the phone. So just think about anything you say can be recorded, even if you're calling to request that, your friend or family calls a lawyer. Now, I've talked a lot about and harped on kind of the right to remain silent. And I want to do kind of one other caveat to that. Let's say cat's out of the bag, ICE already knows that you are a non-citizen. If you are in that situation afraid of returning to your home country, say you're afraid of being harmed if you were deported, you actually do want to say that at every opportunity to every official. The reason I'm saying this is because for folks who are afraid of experiencing something called persecution and want to request asylum, when you say that you're afraid, that is supposed to start a procedure where some kind of official assesses if that claim is true. But ICE might not ask you, like you might not be just given that opportunity, you might have to create it. So if ICE already knows you're a non-citizen and if you're afraid of being deported, it's a good idea to say that at every opportunity you have. Next slide, please. If you're arrested by police, procedures are a little bit different. Within a day or two of your arrest, you can generally expect to see a judge and hear what you're charged with and whether you'll be released or have to pay bail. Unlike immigration court, you actually get assigned a criminal defense attorney, and you'll probably meet them maybe like just before the hearing. And if you're a non-citizen arrested by police, you'll want to find an immigration attorney as soon as possible and be really careful about pleading guilty to anything because you don't know how that could impact your immigration case. So this was essentially kind of a legal lay of the land, but whether to exercise your rights is always going to be a choice that depends on your specific situation. So I want you to be thinking, can I exercise my rights safely in this moment? And then next, how will me exercising my rights affect others' safety? You don't want to make the situation worse for others who ICE is potentially targeting. But I also want people to be keeping in mind how your power, privilege, and identity, also impacts if you can and should exercise your rights in a given situation. We know that Black and Brown people are being targeted and are more likely to have their rights violated. And this is true in this moment, but also just historically. So, if white citizens are always choosing to do what's easiest for them in that moment and just kind of saying, I'm a citizen, here's the information, and not exercising their constitutional rights, that means that the burden of holding the line is going to be falling on the people who are already most at risk in this system. So, just want everyone to keep in mind that we have a shared responsibility to our democracy and to each other. And I want that to be a factor in when we decide to exercise our rights or not. Next slide, please. So up until now, I've been talking a lot about what to do, if in the moment when you're encountering ICE, but there's also things that we can do to be proactive about ICE encounters. Next slide, please. So the reason you might have heard kind of lately about how people are more anxious about ICE activity in places they usually aren't at. And a little bit of background here is that back in 2011, DHS issued guidance on immigration enforcement in sensitive location areas like schools, places of worship, and essentially said we're going to be limiting ICE activity in those areas. Not forbidding it, not like completely prohibiting it, but not focusing on those areas. And that eventually included courthouses as well. But in 2025, that guidance was rescinded. Now, rescinding this guidance did not change our constitutional rights. It did not change ICE's lack of authority to enter private areas without a warrant, and it didn't change the legal rights of private property owners over who actually enters their property. Next slide, please. So one thing that we can all think about doing now is creating different policies. So for example, we know that we have a right to privacy in our own homes, but also for people who are business owners, who are active at churches, who are parts of schools and hospitals, you can create policies now that actually legally limit where ICE is allowed to go. And that's based on whether an area is public or private. So every area of a business or a public building, even if we think of the business as being like open to the public, every area is actually really not private. Most businesses or places have storage facilities. They've got, closets. They've got break rooms. They've got areas that are for staff only. In the doctor's office, exam rooms aren't just open to anybody coming in off the street. So generally, ICE can access public areas just like another member of the public, but they can't access those private areas without a warrant or without consent. So to get into those private places, ICE typically is going to need the owner's permission because, like we talked about, they're usually not going to have that judicial warrant. So next slide, please. So one thing we can all do now is plan ahead or encourage, if you work, your employer, if you are an employer, if you are part of a school, if you, go to a place of worship, we can encourage all of our community to be creating policies now and planning ahead. So one good policy to have is to not collect information that you don't need. And we like to have a little tagline that you can't disclose what you didn't collect. So if ICE comes to your, let's say, place of business and wants information about the citizenship status of your clients, think really hard about whether you actually needed to get that to successfully run your business. And I would guess that for most people, you don't need to know your immigration status. And you want to also, and it's a good policy also to just be treating everybody the same, regardless of immigration status. You can also be placing signs in different areas that are private and not to make it very clear to ICE that, yes, this is a public area, a public lobby, a public waiting room. But this area is private. To enter this area requires permission, and that draws a clean line between where ICE can go and where ICE needs consent. It's also a good idea to designate a point person to enforce that boundary if ICE arrives or requests information. And the way that I think about this a little bit is an example of my own parents, Nick and Holly Rich. They are both lovely people and they are both real advocates for non-citizens. That said, Nick Rich loves a policy. Nick Rich is someone who wants to know like what the rules are and who he is supposed to call if ICE shows up. He does not want to be manning the door and telling ICE no, but if you give Nick Rich a set of instructions, he is going to follow it and he's going to say, I know if ICE shows up, this is the person that I call. In contrast, Holly Rich is raring for a nice encounter. She is so ready to tell agents that she needs to see a warrant and they can't go somewhere. So I want you to think like in your own business, in your church, in your school, who are your Nicks? Who are your Hollies? Because everybody has a role to play here to protect each other, but it does not have to be the same role. And you also want to train all your staff to know what to do. So if ICE arrives, think about who's going to be the person that's going to request identification, refuse to offer information, ask to see a warrant, call the designee, and be prepared to assert those rights. And having just like some really basic policies can make people feel more prepared and more empowered and know what they're supposed to do if ICE does come to where they are. Next slide, please. So there is a legal doctrine called harboring, and I think we have time to go through this very quickly. Okay, so um, there is kind of an exception in law, like when we're trying to support non-citizens, that I want people to be aware of because it's not as expansive as people think. I think harboring has been kind of used like as the boogeyman a little bit lately, and it's actually a lot more limited than folks are aware of. So broadly speaking, harboring is a criminal law, a federal criminal law that makes it illegal to conceal, harbor, or shield an undocumented immigrant from detection. So essentially, it is sheltering or assisting an undocumented immigrant to lawfully remain in the US with knowledge or reckless disregard of that unlawful status. Importantly, sheltering does not include daily interactions, like if someone wants to rent an apartment or if you're driving someone to an immigration lawyer. And it usually applies to people who are like taking steps to conceal and enable people to live undetected. So for example, if, ICE comes to a building and someone shouts to them, run, ICE is here, like you better get out of here. That's starting to sound a little bit more like harboring. In contrast, if that person just says, if ICE says, is so and so here, and the person at the door says, I'm using my right to remain silent, that is not harboring. You are not lying. You are not providing false information. You're not concealing anybody. You're just exercising your rights. So it really requires an intent and also a knowledge or a reckless disregard that somebody is undocumented, which if you don't actually ask someone for their immigration status, it is impossible to tell if someone is undocumented. Just because someone is speaking a different language or was born in a different country, you don't know their immigration status. So that kind of knowledge or recklessness requirement is also pretty high, which folks are not realizing. Um, Next slide, please. So these are some examples of what harboring is. Remember, it's concealing, it's trying to help someone avoid detection in the moment. So, driving a getaway car, that feels harboring. But just driving someone to an immigration appointment to go talk to a lawyer, that is not harboring. Smuggling is kind of the typical harboring example. Next slide, please. What is not harboring is, I think, what actually probably covers most of the way that folks want to support non-citizens, providing basic needs without knowing, someone's immigration status or not someone who's actively evading immigration officials. So, for example, church asked me, like if I'm running like a soup kitchen, if I'm, or doing a food drive, giving food to anybody who needs it. That is not harboring. You do not know the immigration status of anybody there, and providing food is not assisting someone in remaining in the US or evading immigration officers. Knowing your rights presentations, also not harboring. Non-discrimination policies of just treating everybody the same or not collecting information, not harboring. Advocating for immigrants' rights and legal changes. That is not harboring. And neither is, remember, exercising your rights to refuse entry without a warrant. That is not harboring. Next slide, please. And just briefly, so now thinking about if you believe your rights have been violated in those interactions, if ICE comes to your home, your place of work, while you're driving on the street, always want to write down what happened and include specific details, make a list of any witnesses, and please, you can report that violation to a lawyer or to a civil rights organization like the ACLU. Next slide, please. So these are all ways that you as individuals, I hope, feel empowered now to go out into the world, educate other people about their rights, know how to exercise your own rights. But I'm also very excited to be sharing with you some of the bills that our advocacy team here is going to be promoting in the State House in Vermont this legislative session. Because we know, like I said, a lot of immigration is federal law. They kind of can control who gets status. But states actually have a lot of power about whether that status should really impact someone's ability to have their basic needs met and how we as a state are respecting their dignity. So there are things that the state of Vermont can and should be doing to protect non-citizens. Next slide, please. So in the past several months, we have seen Vermonters really step up and call on the state to advance and defend the rights of everyone who calls Vermont home. And so we're very excited to be channeling that energy into legislative action this session. So I've listed three of kind of the proposals that we are pushing for the state to adopt. The first, and this would be a huge game changer, is state-funded access to immigration counsel for folks who are who are in detention. So although immigration, we know, has really serious consequences for someone's immediate and long-term safety, unlike people who are arrested and detained for criminal violations, civil detainees are actually not entitled to any kind of state-funded attorney right now. So that means, like, if you're arrested for a crime, you get a lawyer appropriately. But if you are arrested for violating immigration law and are at risk of being deported to a country where you could be harmed, you actually don't get a lawyer in that situation. You have to navigate this really thorny legal process, maybe in a language you don't understand, without any attorney. And statistics, unsurprisingly, demonstrate that people who are detained non-citizens pursuing their immigration cases without lawyers are exponentially more likely to be deported. Like the differences are huge. And the state already provides public defenders to folks who are facing criminal charges. And we are proposing that that just be expanded to folks who are being civilly detained in our jails and prisons right now. We know the Trump administration is actively dismantling any semblance of justice from the immigration court system by creating just legal and procedural hurdles for non-citizens who are in removal proceedings. And so this would strike a really powerful blow against the federal government's deportation agenda and show that Vermont is really protecting the due process rights of all of its residents. Another proposal that we are pushing for is to be safeguarding, I'm sorry, first improving conditions in detention. So, and removing different barriers to accessing legal and medical services. So, as folks might remember, we have recently renewed as a state our contracts with ICE and with Border Patrol. And part of Vermont's justification for renewing those DOC contracts was that conditions in Vermont prison are supposed to be so much better than places like Louisiana and Texas. But advocates who have access to those facilities in Vermont are knowing that that is not the case. People in detention, especially those who don't speak English, are unable to contact their families or their attorneys if they do have them. They're unable to request basic medical care, and some don't even have access to clean water and are resorting to just melting ice in cups to have something to drink, and they don't know how to ask for better conditions. The state is falling woefully short of meeting its moral and legal obligations to people in its custody, and we are calling on the legislature to change that. And our third proposal is to be safeguarding our community spaces. So, you might remember I talked a few slides ago about sensitive locations and how there used to be more of a commitment that ICE was not going to be invading our schools and our churches and our hospitals. Remember, that guidance has been rescinded. But we are advocating for legislative change that would prohibit ICE from gaining access to places like schools and state agencies, the private areas of those, like classrooms, without a judicial warrant. And we also want to create model policies that would empower business owners to assert their rights on behalf of their employees. And really, the goal here is to reclaim a sense of safety in our community spaces and prevent ICE from kind of commandeering state buildings and resources to effectuate its anti-immigrant policies. So my hope is that people on this call and across the state will join us and support these legislative proposals by calling the representatives, sending letters, providing testimony, all of the skills that we've been talking about and building in the Advocacy Academy. And we can also do our part by continuing to show up for each other. So I want to be clear, like the Trump administration has done real harm, but it has also overpromised. And overall, the only way that Trump can fully deliver on those promises is if we help him by behaving as if our rights have already been stripped away. But we can encourage our legislators, our leaders, and each other to hold that line. And Emmy, I'll pass it back to you for closing thoughts and any questions.
Thank you, Hillary. Yeah, we're going to open it up for just a few minutes for any questions you may have for Hillary or about our advocacy. I do want to say before we open up for questions that we will be definitely cluing folks in during the session as to where our priority bills are, how they're moving. So you will have the opportunity to call your legislators, write letters. We are very happy to provide that and help you participate. And before questions, I also wanted to say if you are not a member of our action team, please consider joining. It is super easy. It's just signing up with your email. You can find it right on our website under Get Involved and join our action team. And that way you'll be in touch with me about more activities for volunteers, ways to stay plugged in. If you want to sit down for coffee, I would love to, and talk more about our advocacy programs. So does anyone have any questions either about Know Your Rights or the topics that we talked about? And you are welcome to either put them in the chat. You should be able to have access to the chat, or if you'd just like to unmute yourself and ask, that is totally okay too. So I'll just give a minute if anyone wants to ask anything before we close out for the night. Yeah, it looks like Jeffrey has a question. I will allow you to talk. Oh, wait, I think that's the wrong person. One moment. Okay, Jeffrey. I think you just have to unmute yourself and then you'll be able to talk. Maybe. No, maybe not.
Well, if tech's not working, you are welcome to send me an email with your question. It's hrich@acluVT.org. You can also send questions to info@acluVT.org and be happy to answer what I can.
And I will drop Hillary's email in the chat and then also my email in the chat if you would like to get in touch. Jeff, last chance to unmute. Okay. We will sign off for now then. And if folks do want to follow up, please feel free to follow up with us or at info@acluvt.org. As you may know, this is actually the last session of our Advocacy Academy. It was a 4-week series, and we're wrapping up right before holiday season, so please be safe. And we look forward to seeing you next year. Legislature starts January 7th, and we'll be running until May, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to participate then. But I want to thank you all for coming, and please stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks much, everyone. Bye.